Well, thank you, folks, for making it through the day and such a great turnout. I know that it's been a long couple of days and a great couple of days here at the Health Summit, and I will try to get through this as painlessly as possible and to try to get the conversation rolling, which is my objective today, is to really sort of I take this as an opportunity to engage in a conversation with members of the community, members of the gay community, LGBTQ community, members of the academic and social and health research communities, and members of the community at whole. And I would really love and encourage us to be able to have a dialogue, either while I'm talking today or after. And one of my objectives for being here today was to really sort of build bridges between the communities of researchers, between myself and various communities, to have people start really thinking about these issues that I'm going to talk about, particularly with relation to gay and bisexual men and their involvement as purchasers in the commercial sex industry. Now, having said that, I think that it's kind of important to really situate ourselves as to what is this thing called the sex industry, because quite often you hear it in mainstream media, you hear it thrown around within the research community, and many people sort of, the assumption is, well, we'll talk about the sex industry, and nobody bothers to actually define what that means. And so I thought that it would be good to start with a kind of little visual of what I'm talking about when I'm looking at the sex industry. I see the sex industry at the very basic as a continuum of this. I actually think it continues way further than this. But for the sake of most of the conversations around this, and most of the research within the health and social science community, it really sort of looks at everything coming from adult film all the way through to webcam, phone sex, exotic dance, fetish, BDSM, prostitution, and so on and so forth. Now, my particular sort of entry point is really looking at the sort of red shaded area there, the physical contact aspects of the industry. While I've looked at other elements, I'm really particularly fascinated at this continuum, and I'm fascinated with people's trajectories in and through these, and I'm also fascinated with the fundamental similarities and differences that are comprised in each parts of this sector of this industry. Now, related to this, I think that when we start talking about this term, prostitution, and I think that a lot of people also, we start on the wrong foot. We don't actually make it clear what it is that we're actually talking about, what this industry looks like. Quite often, our understanding of this industry is based on stereotypes that we have. They're generated from mainstream media, generated from a few active, vocal political parties and participants that talk about prostitution, and it conjures up a very particular image. Usually the image that it conjures up is drug dependency, poverty. Usually it's associated with impoverished females and as sellers, and a seedy underworld of individuals who are related to organized crime through drugs and so on and so forth. The industry in itself is much more complex and multifaceted than that. And so I felt that it would probably be interesting just to put this up. And I've provided a couple of kind of conservative estimates as to the relative size of the industry as it spans out. And we worked from this sort of what is the defining point, the street, which, most contemporary estimates put it at about 15 to 20%, although I think that that's a gross overestimate. It's probably more like 5 to 10%. And then you have varying levels of parlors, brothels, bathhouses, escort services, independent, in-call, out-call, all of these. And for me, I'm interested in the entirety of this industry when I'm looking at people who purchase sexual services and their relationships to it. So when I come to this area, there are 5 main kind of points kind of motivate me, especially with regard to my talk here today. When we look at this industry, our understanding of it is primarily premised on a belief that it's an industry dominated or occupied by women, and dominated and occupied by survival street-based workers. Little theoretical and empirical attention has been provided to understanding the people who purchase sexual services. And let's face it, without people purchasing sexual services, the industry in and of itself cannot exist. Right? Now, certainly the argument has been made that one can create an industry by driving demand, but let's face it, that's simply not how the industry works. The other thing that I find fascinating is, even though very little attention has been paid to people of purchase, equally little attention has been paid to the males, bisexual, gay males, and women who bisexual, heterosexual, and gay women who frequent industry as consumers. And equal amounts of non-attention has been paid to the men and transsexual individuals who sell sexual services. 95% of our attention around this industry focuses in on women, and that to me is curious. The other thing about this is that when people are looking at this industry and the people are involved in it, especially from the purchasing side, a lot of the times assumptions are made about the individuals who are involved. And these assumptions have dramatic implications for the health and safety of individuals that are involved in the industry, but it also have dramatic implications for policy, outreach, legislation, regulation of this industry. Specifically when it comes to gay and bisexual buyers, this is of deep concern to me, because when I look at the body of research and the body of knowledge and the body of attention around this industry, what I see is a massive silence. And that silence, to me, is an indication of lack of understanding, lack of knowledge. And for me, lack of knowledge means risk. Right? When we don't know something about an industry, there's the true risk. Not the people that are involved in the industry is the risk, but our ignorance is a risk. It's a risk to the people who are involved. So, towards these end, partially towards this end, I've been privileged enough over the years to be involved in several investigations of the industry. And the two most recent are the ones that I want to talk a little bit about today. I've got the so-called John's Voice study, which was a CHR initiative, part of a larger grant looking at HIV vulnerability in the off-street industry. And then I've got the sex safety and security study. Now, I've been fortunate because these two studies comprise the two largest investigations of consumers of sexual services that have ever been conducted globally. And one is ongoing. So the sex safety security study, if you know anybody that is interested in participating, give me a call. That's an ongoing study. It's set to match the success of the John's Voice study. This is very exciting to me for a number of reasons, because now for the first time ever we have large-scale comparative data to look at and suss out larger patterns that are happening in the industry. The other thing that is interesting and what I want to talk about today is the particular subsamples of gay and bisexual participants that I've managed to acquire in both of these. Now, the gay and bisexual population of sex buyers has been a particularly difficult one to access through mainstream channels. And I'm very happy to have this sample size, but I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that it's this small. I'm disappointed that we aren't able to talk about to include a larger number of voices in this, because the exclusion of voices, to me, those silences, again, are quite dangerous. Now, what I want to, before I get into anything more, I want to sort of alert you to a number of things. I'm not here today to make generalizations about any population. I don't think that one can ever do that on the basis of a convenient sample of participants or a volunteer sample of participants from a population from which we don't know the boundaries. What I am here to do today is to present a couple of sort of interesting patterns that have emerged through the interaction between the quantitative aggregate data that we've been able to collect and the qualitative in-depth phenomenological or interview data. To me, the real importance lies in the ability of these two forms of information to speak to one another, to start filling silences and to start generating questions. And that to me is where I'm really at, especially with relation to gay and bisexual males' involvement. I'm at the stage where it's time to generate more questions and to draw upon community to help generate those questions. Because as I've said, this area is completely under-theorized and and people have been virtually ignored for many years. So just to paint a quick picture, not for profiling purposes, but just to give you a sense of what the typical participant in each of these samples looks like. Not, again, to highlight the fact that to say that this is the average sex bar would be incorrect. To me, that notion of talking about the average or typical is somewhat of, well, it's a statistical fallacy, to be quite honest with you. But what I wanted to do is show you how similar two samples are that have been gathered at three-year intervals. To me, this is really encouraging. When you go out into a wider population and you cast a wide net and you come back with two very similar samples of individuals reporting very similar experiences and attitudes and beliefs, when you can't get a representative sample of the population, this is the closest thing that you can get to being somewhat confident that you're revealing some truths, small t, of course, across the samples. A couple of noticeable things is, it's particularly interesting in relation to self-identified gay individuals and the kind of decline at that, and the dramatic, a slight increase in people identifying as bisexual or questioning. I don't know why that's happening. Hopefully somebody can give me some insights into that. Otherwise, reasonably comparable. Now, when it comes to what people are buying, or where they're buying, and how frequently, again, amongst gay and bisexual males, this is also quite interesting, quite comforting. In both samples, we have relatively similar lifetime purchasing experiences. On average, buying about 100 times in lifetime. Both samples, a little bit of a difference in terms of how much they purchased in the previous 12 months, 6 versus almost 15. But what is interesting to me is looking at the comparability of where gay and bisexual men are purchasing sex, and also the shifts. So in John's voice was 2008 to 2010. What we see is independent in-call, escort, massage parlor, independent out-call, street, and then online. And then as we approach in 2013, we see an increase in independent out-call, an increase in massage parlor, an increase in online, a decrease in street, and a dramatic decrease in escort. This is something we also see within the wider demographic, comparing it with the heterosexual buying community. And for me, it marks a very interesting shift in how the sex industry is playing out. A move to online venues, a move towards independent, and certainly a move off the street and into other venues, which from a perspective of people who are interested in harm reduction or health and safety, that's an important thing. It's an important thing to observe. Okay, the other thing, that's the last of the numbers. Because to me, one of the things, I can come in and present a dizzying array of statistics and numbers that people will look and see out of context. But I thought it would be more interesting and perhaps more beneficial to just talk about some of the patterns that I'm observing as I sift through both the quantitative and qualitative data, the interviews, and to really pose more questions than to try to present more answers. I hope today people can walk away thinking about what this means and thinking about what it means in terms of wider patterns. All of this sort of couched within my appreciation of the fact that through the interviews and through looking at the data, I am discerning distinct patterns in terms of life course, space, and structural constraints. So as people graduate through various life course stages, moving from youth to young adulthood to later adulthood to old age, what we see and hear are very different stories of how they experience the sex industry, but also when we talk to individuals about their experiences in different venues, what we tend to see is how they relate in those venues, in those spaces, is also markedly different, and that has implications for health and safety and the relationship that people have to community. So I start with this notion that many gay and bisexual buyers report living with high levels of physical pain. Now, this is something that has emerged from the sex safety security study, because we started looking more concertedly at this notion of physical health and physical health over life course for individuals. What does it mean to be healthy? Young and healthy, old and healthy, and everything in between and healthy, or to be unhealthy physically. And what constraints does that have? Now, where this has emerged as particularly interesting comes in how people talk about their entree into the sex industry. For some people, physical unwellness, physical pain, has been a vehicle through which they've tried to cure that physical pain, sometimes through massage, and massage turning to erotic massage. And that's been very interesting to me to hear those stories, but also to see them play out in the large scale, in the statistical data. How people say, well, what motivated you to see a sex worker for the first time? Well, I went for a massage, right? And that massage then turned to something more. Right? And then to sit down and have a conversation with somebody and have them say, yeah, I needed to not just sort of work out pain, but I needed touch. And that leads to another part. This notion, again, connected to physical health, but also connected to life course, is this notion of physical disability or ailment. And what that means, particularly for gay males in community, when one is older, when one is physically disabled, what does that mean in terms of their capacity to attract a mate, to be sexually attractive, to be sexually connected? In several of the interviews that I've had with individuals, they talk and reflect back on what it was like when they were a youth and how that has changed as they've got older. And a couple of individuals that I've spoken to over the years have talked about how when they suffered a physical impairment, a crippling, a disease, or an actual body image, and they felt themselves confined, and they would go for months, if not years, without the sensation of touch or intimacy. What does that mean for any person, regardless of sexuality, to go for years without touch or any type of intimacy? And that led, in some cases, to the decision to purchase that intimacy. From there, there's also this notion of physical and sexual health as a gateway for the exploration and expression of sex and sexual identity. This is also tied, or it also appears to be tied, with many of the men who have completed our survey and men that I've talked to this notion of coming out or determining one's sexuality. So the pathway that one takes to exploring sexuality. Some of the men that have participated in the survey in particular have reported that commercial sex, paying for sex, was how they first determined that they were in fact gay, or bisexual for that matter. That this was a legitimate avenue, a non-threatening avenue for them to determine, is this what I want? Is this really me? For others, on the opposite side of the continuum, well, this data doesn't speak to it, but over the years talking with people who have been involved selling sexual services, that fluid kind of notion of how one gets into the sex, playing gay or playing straight, using it as a vehicle for expressing sexuality. Some of the younger men that I've talked to, gay and bisexual men, also have mentioned and talked about using the sex industry as a vehicle for satiating sexual desire. We have all heard that too. These are things that are all important in terms of not just, health and wellness, but they're interesting patterns. The other aspect of that, for me, that is particularly, that is particularly fascinating. It relates back to the physical disability thing, is this notion of the sexual currency that one has as they graduate through their life course stages, as they move through life course stages, as one gets older, regardless of what one's sexuality is. As one gets older, the desire to feel wanted, to feel virile, to feel sexual, it doesn't go away. And many of the studies that we have on people aging and sexuality, we have an entire industry that is actually catered towards, the little blue pill. Right? And in essence, when I talk to gay and bisexual men, especially about this notion of the declining sense of connection, the declining sense of being wanted within community, as a space where the decision has to be made about how do I remain a sexual being when nobody finds me sexual, right? And so purchasing is a space where, for some men that have participated in our research, this is something that is a legitimate issue. The other thing that has come out, and this is one we hear quite frequently, and one that I'm a little bit ambivalent about in some respects, is the connection between sexual risk, sexual health risk, and participation in the sex industry. Much of the catalyst for research into this area, especially dating back to the late 80s, throughout the 90s, and somewhat to date, has been this issue around sexual health. The sex industry as a bridge or a vector of disease transmission between populations. And of course, who gets targeted as being, the principal component in that vector? Gay males. Right? And that really fueled a lot of that industry in the research in the early 90s coming out of epidemiology. Now, this is interesting to me for a number of reasons, because I talk at length with individuals who are involved, and we, of course, have survey data that asks about sexual knowledge, sexual testing, and sexual behavior, right, in terms of sexual health. And one thing that I've found, which I find very fascinating, is gay males and then bisexual males have a greater knowledge of HIV and STIs than do their heterosexual counterparts, get tested far more frequently than their heterosexual counterparts. And so if there's knowledge and testing, one has to wonder to what degree it's fair or accurate to paint an entire population as risky or at risk, simply on the basis of a sexual identity. Now, this is important to me on a number of levels. Where I do see it, and this does come back to this collision of life course, lifestyle, and to a certain extent venue, where people are engaging in commercial sexual relations. In certain spaces with certain lifestyles and at certain life course stages, heavy alcohol and drug use is prevalent. And in that prevalence, there we find at-risk sexual behavior. But to paint an entire community as being risky, not all gay or bisexual males engage in intravenous drug use or heavy alcohol, binge alcohol consumption. But a lot of the studies to date painted in that respect. So for me, it's opening up more questions than answers. The second and final area that I'd like to talk about today is this notion of the relationship between masculinity, sexuality, life course, and law. One thing I found really fascinating, time and time again, both quantitative and qualitatively, is that gay men and bisexual men don't know the law on prostitution. Comparatively speaking, are far less likely to know the legalities surrounding prostitution than their heterosexual counterparts. Now, I don't know precisely why this is. I can only speculate, and there's not a lot of theory to support this. And I'm, again, reaching out for answers around this. I think part of it is the much less likely to see what individuals are doing as prostitution. Because again, most of the mainstream media constructions around this envision prostitution as street-based women, right? So gay men might be exchanging goods and services for sexual services, but not define it as prostitution. And so therefore, the law is not something that gay men need to really think about. And this actually collides quite well with the second point. Gay and bisexual men are incredibly unlikely to come into contact with the law, right? Police don't do stings on gay sellers very often. Not to say they don't, but it is incredibly rare. Mostly, I think, tied into this notion of masculinity. To have a big, burly, heterosexual police officer posing as a gay male to bust men buying sex. It's so much easier for the VPD to put one of their female officers out in a miniskirt to bust heterosexual clients. So the likelihood, and this is supported with my past research where we've looked at arrest records. And it's also supported by, I spent 12 months in John's school in Toronto, and not once did a gay male come through in 12 months. So the police were not arrested. So I think that this is important because the relationship to the law is important for a number of reasons. The other aspect of this that I find quite interesting is when I've spoken with, both through the surveys and interviews, with gay and bisexual male, one thing that consistently comes up is a lack of faith in the law and the government to regulate this industry. And specifically, older men of older life course positions tend to reflect back and provide very interesting stories of their relationship to the oppressive state and their experience of it. Their experience of a state that didn't really look out for the interests of gay and bisexual male. So why then would we all of a sudden have this faith that the state is going to act well towards this community? And that, again, really tied into this life course, but also ties into other things that are particularly interesting. This notion of gay and bisexual men's experience with authority, both through resistance and resiliency and abuse, and how that has factored in. I don't know how this plays out. And as I say, at this point in time, I'm just sort of planting the seeds for theorizing about this as we move forward, because it's an entirely sort of understudied area. So we'll finish off with a couple of insights that I'd like to, share. I think that studying gay and bisexual men only in relation to health, sexual health, can be quite fruitful, but it can also be quite dangerous because it can hide some of the very real experiences that people within communities and outside communities have. I also think that it's problematic, as I've said, to talk about sex buyers, people who purchase sexual services, regardless of whether we're talking about males, females, gay, straight, whatever, through as though they represent a homogeneous group. To say that all gay males are the same, and to say that all sex buyers are the same, is ludicrous. And to approach studying these communities as the same, to me, is just dangerous. Related to that, laws, policies, education, and outreach that are being developed in relation to the sex industry from the vantage point of the majority or from the vantage point of seeing a particular problem can be incredibly dangerous because they will ultimately run a great potential for negatively affecting the minority. And this is a very real thing right now. In Canada, with the current constitutional or charter challenge to the prostitution laws and the movement towards creating a new set of laws to regulate an industry. And all of those conversations are happening with primarily one voice directing them, or one set of experiences directing them. And as one looks at those, it's important to see who's not at that table and talking. This has tremendous implications for health and welfare of individuals in community. Now, having said that, I think it's important, and I guess I'll leave off on this today, while I appreciate research by community for community, I also think that it's important to really think critically about what value it is to study community separately. Yes, I get it from a political vantage point, but from the vantage point of being able to draw upon parallels, similarities, and overlaps in experience between communities, that actually, to me, offers some very fruitful ways forward. And it also helps us to break down stereotypes that exist on a number of intersecting axes. And on the final thing relating back to this issue of as policy and law changes in Canada and bringing voices to the table, I don't think that it's very wise for us in any community to allow one group to fight a battle and then to fight the same battle 5 years later, 10 years later. If we can join forces, join various community interests to move things forward in terms of policy or legislation, I think that ultimately just makes sense. Anyway, thank you very much, and I look forward.
Thanks, Chris. That was awesome.